All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. Here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I'm very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Paul Conti. Paul, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
You are welcome. So in Dr. Conti's book, Trauma, the Invisible Epidemic, he examines the most recent research, clinical best practices, and real-life stories to present a deeper and more urgent view of trauma. He identifies the changes that we can make, both as individuals and as a society, to alleviate trauma's effect and prevent further traumatization in the future. Dr. Conti reveals that what we once considered a lifelong, unbeatable illness is both treatable and preventable. Dr. Conti, MD, is a graduate of Stanford University School of Medicine. He completed his psychiatry training at Stanford and at Harvard, where he was appointed chief resident. He then served on the medical faculty before founding the Pacific Premier Group. Founded in 2014, PPG's approach blends both brain biology and psychology, and their work acknowledges and honors the devastating effects trauma can have both upon individuals and the systems they inhabit. Paul, welcome.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
So let's start out first. Share with the listeners where you are from originally and where you are currently.
Sure. I'm originally from Trenton, New Jersey, and I am based now in Portland, Oregon. I've practiced locations in New York and in a couple of other places, but my family and my home is in Portland, Oregon.
Nice. I'm in Bend.
Oh, you're in Bend?
Yeah,
I didn't know
I'm
that. Oh, beautiful.
Originally from New York.
Okay.
So here we are. Awesome.
Wow. Oh, it's a lovely place there. I'm
Yeah.
glad. Yeah.
So, all right. How the heck did you get into this field, into this interest specialization?
Well, I came to medicine as a second career, and I think it's been very helpful to me to conceive of myself as sort of an outsider, which I think does help one observe, a system if you you're in it, but you also feel sort of out of it, and I think that, along with just doing a lot of clinical work, in my residency and in the years right after residency, I saw so many patients in so many different settings. And I started to just see the commonality that—
what was your first career?
I had a business career.
Okay.
I worked for a consulting firm in New York for a bunch of years. And I started seeing, okay, I'm treating different things, right? And maybe I'm treating anxiety, or I'm treating panic attacks, depression, insomnia. There's so many different things I'm treating. But if you look at the root of those things, including drug and alcohol abuse and addiction and avoidance and poor life choices, if you look at all of it, at the root of so much of it was always trauma. That if instead of trying to sort of in a superficial way scoot along the surface and say, okay, let me take stock of what symptoms you may have, and let me give you a tactic or two or a medicine or two to decrease the symptoms, right? Which we're sort of taught to do, unfortunately, because the medical system is really interested in throughput, right? It's not necessarily interested in, it's interested in cost containment and throughput, not understanding in the things that take more time, right? But if you're trying to understand and you're trying to help people really understand what's going on with them so they can change it and be better, then that path led to trauma in the vast majority of cases. And that feeling and opinion and just understanding and route to helping, to really seeing people change when we approached it that way, grew and grew in me over the years. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, well, I need to say something about this, right? Because our polish the hood when there's a problem in the engine healthcare system, doesn't want to look at things this way. It wants to take stock of symptoms, whether it's mental health or other areas of medicine, is, throughput, cost containment is really the rule of the day. And are we really helping people get better? I mean, I think the answer is clearly no, right? I mean, all we have to do is look at the basic statistics. 100,000 overdose deaths in this country, among, many other statistics I could cite about suicide and, how many medical complaints, general medical complaints arise from mental health. And, there's so much data to tell us that we're not doing a good job understanding and taking care of ourselves as a population. And I think we need to understand the impact of trauma, the brain science rooted changes in us from trauma, and the cascade of domino effects, both in a person and between people, that come from trauma.
All right. So that was an overview. When you were in residency, you started seeing this?
I started seeing it in residency, but I don't think it was until I was out of residency that I started putting really cogent thoughts like, wait a second, there's something here that when we do the detective work, right? Like we're finding this same thing. We're finding different flavors of it.
Right.
Sometimes we're finding acute trauma, chronic trauma, vicarious trauma in its different forms. But what we're finding that needs to be understood, addressed, and changed for a person to be happier and healthier is trauma.
Right. And were you able to, what did that look like for you with boots on the ground in a sense? Were you able to address that given the fact that you were in a system, right? You were.
Yeah. Yeah, you could try and address that. Sure. I mean, it wasn't so easy with, for example, when I first started off and was working through insurance systems where they're 15-minute appointments, right? I mean, it's not easy to do that, but sometimes you could have repeated appointments. So we start talking about, hey, let's try and get to the root of this, right? And then we work like hell at it for 15 minutes and we do it again in a couple of days, right? And at times people could access a therapist as well, because as a psychiatrist, I think I should also be and am a therapist, right? But oftentimes care ends up getting split, and that's okay if there's a good, therapist who's working along with the therapeutic work and potentially the medicine work that I'm doing, then we could come at something and really get a person interested in it. Like you don't have to hide from this. That reflex of guilt and shame that happens in us after trauma, like we can look at that, right? And there can be a safe and healthy environment in which to let things out that the person may have been keeping inside. Because once we start looking for things, right, it's so often not a surprise. I mean, sometimes it is, but it's so often not a surprise to the person that the trauma is there, right? They know that bad accident left them feeling differently, right? They know that the sexual assault 20 years ago left them different, right? But they're afraid, ashamed, don't think anything can be done about it, right? So when you bring that message of hope that we can understand and change this, you don't have to be treating depression on a surface level, knowing it's going to continuously recur and make your life miserable. We can do something that gets to the root of it, and maybe that depression doesn't have to come back. Or if it's coming back, it's more infrequent, it's milder, it's more addressable. And then people start getting excited, right? Knowledge brings empowerment. Empowerment brings hope. And once there's hope, there's excitement for change. So it was just engaging with people in a way of hey, let's together trying to figure this out instead of having some agreement, that we didn't really agree to, that we're just going to polish the hood because the systems around us are telling us that's all we have to do in our 15 minutes together, right? That's not the way life has to go.
At what point did you say to yourself, I need to write this book, Trauma, the Invisible Epidemic?
Somewhere around 7 years ago or so, 6-7 years, that I thought, I really think I should do this, that it was a tedious and painstaking process for me. So it's not a process I would take on lightly. And in some way, sure, is it good for my career and my clinic? It is, but is that enough for me to have written this book in the middle of the night and on airplanes and, in the minimal free time I might have? That's not enough. I mean, for me to have written it, I had to experience over and over again, talking to patients and also talking to other practitioners, often well-meaning practitioners in systems, and realizing people are not looking at trauma. We are a polish the hood society, right? Unfortunately, not just in our healthcare, but in our healthcare is bad enough. And the idea that I can't keep saying the same things over and over again, right? Without doing something to try and get the word out there in a way that reaches people that I'll never get to see or talk to.
So let's dive into the book a little bit here. What did you want to say in the book?
I wanted to say that trauma is with us. It is pervasive. It acts in us in ways that are so, in a sense, evil, right? That it prevents us from seeing the very changes that are happening in us. And I've seen that more times than I can count.
All right, let's give us an example there.
So trauma changes emotion, right? The limbic system, the emotion system in us, which is what gives our memories meaning. So an example that I give, because I think it's so clear, is a person who won an award back in high school, right? That was seen as a big achievement and showed that this person could go forward and could like work hard and achieve things in life. And there was hope and goodness ahead, right? Because the award symbolized that. They drew it all together, right? And then after trauma, unrelated to that, right? After a significant trauma that changed this person's brain. This is not an esoteric concept. Mm-hmm. This is a concept that the cutting edge of neurobiology and neuroimaging tells us is true. So after trauma changed that person's brain, she didn't see it that way anymore. The award was a mockery of like, oh, that's the best you're ever going to do, right? And you get some award, right? And then you're going to go forward and you're going to have a life that's not going to give you the good things that you want, right? She saw it in an entirely different way and didn't remember that she saw it any differently, right? And yes, like the award is important, but I'm and this is a true story, right? But I'm using that to capture that she felt differently about herself. She didn't feel hopeful. She wasn't grounded to her competence, her conscientiousness, her ability to navigate the world. She saw herself through a light of guilt and shame and ineffectiveness. And she saw, like, I'm not going to have good relationships and no one's ever really going to love me. And you know, I'm not going to be able to go find the career I want. I mean, she just saw all that as absolutely true without a recollection that, hey, before the trauma, you didn't see it that way at all, right? And that's one example of hundreds upon hundreds I could give of trauma changing a person's brain towards higher levels of vigilance, higher levels of anxiety, avoidance behaviors, all sorts of behavioral change, poorer role performance, right? All sorts of this kind of thing that changes a person's life and changes it without the person knowing, hey, wait, I'm different, right? Mm-hmm. Or if the person knows that, then it comes for just seconds or moments of knowing. Then the person feels so afraid. Like, what am I going to do about that, right? If I start thinking about that, I'll cry forever. Mm-hmm. I'll curl up in a ball. I won't be able to function. So then they turn their thoughts away from it, as opposed to what we really need to do is to say, you can look at that. You're not going to curl up in a ball and cry forever. Guess what's going to happen? You're going to get better. Mm-hmm. Right? That there is empowerment to be had here. The reflexive guilt and shame and fear and avoidance doesn't have to rule your life. And oh my goodness, the change. So again, it's not an esoteric concept. It's based in brain science and it's based in the clinical truth of doing it this way with people, which again is not rocket science. To me, it's just the common sense of how to help people. Mm-hmm. I'm not the only one doing it. When you see people who are doing it, what do you see? Real change for the better in that person's life, physical health, emotional health, enjoyment of life. Like, yes, we see those things change.
So my guess is that this was a person you maybe treated. Mm-hmm. And what does treatment look like for this individual? Number one. And number two, does treatment involve actual changing of the brain?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So the answer I'll answer the latter question, yes. And again, that's not an esoteric thing. There's data about this, right? There is hard science research that shows that psychotherapy applied to a process of understanding and change does indeed change the brain. And it changes it away from the negative things that happen after trauma, and it changes it towards normalcy, right? Mm-hmm. Which is of course why people get better. And as therapists, of course, we have to, in my opinion, we have to have all sorts of arrows in the quiver, right? So we have to build a relationship and a rapport and build safety. And we might use some DBT informed techniques or CBT informed techniques, psychodynamic, unconscious mind exploration, interpersonal techniques. I mean, we have to have arrows in the quiver, right? But it's bringing the quiver to bear by establishing a collaborative relationship, a good rapport with the person that I'm taking care of, right? To say, let's figure this out together. I'm not looking to shame you. I'm not looking to make you feel better. I mean, sometimes you have to say that. Sometimes it just comes about in the relationship that we can go wherever there is to go, right? In order to help you feel better. And then it's remarkable how, not always, but how often people then will sort of readily go there, right? Because the fear and nothing can help me, and this is just a mark of shame and stigma, changes to like, hey, I can go look at this. I can see it in a different way. And a classic aspect of that is the frame shift, like help someone see themselves as they would see someone else, right? As you know, it's a very basic technique, but how powerful is it? How many people have I seen telling me how, oh no, that assault is their fault, right? They should have dressed differently, went out, not gone out at night, like all sorts of reasons. Would you say that to someone else? They say, no, of course not, right? Like, you know, I would know, my God, how cruel that would be, right? But like, you know, this is a normal human thing where we tend to stigmatize and blame and persecute ourselves, right, in ways that we would not do to other people. So it's just an example of a route in that, like, that will gain a person's curiosity that, wow, like you're saying things to yourself that you would never in 1,000 years say to someone else, or you wouldn't tolerate someone else whispering in your ear, you're not worth anything. That awful thing was your fault, right? You wouldn't do that, right? And then the person starts to become interested in, wow, what is the narrative in me, right? What is the self-talk inside of me? What is the life narrative I'm creating for myself? You know, that starts to get interesting because it can be so stark that like, oh, wait, so this really doesn't make any sense. And my God, it's making me miserable.
What worked, quote unquote, with this particular person with we're talking about here? What in terms of treatment?
Well, you know, the truth is there's several examples. When I tell the story of a certain person, it just comes to mind. But there are a lot of examples like this of early in life achievements, right? Sure. And look, sometimes, you know, things don't work, right? The weight of trauma is too high. The person can't get over it. We do see bad outcomes, right? So I don't want to gloss over and say, okay, everything is, which is why we have to focus on prevention, right? Like sometimes things do not well, and the addiction that came of the trauma ends the person's life, right? Which we 100,000 overdose deaths in this country in a year, like that's tragically not a rare thing, right? But when it works, when a person engages and it works, that you see whichever, no matter what techniques you're bringing to bear, what ultimately happens is a shift inside that person in how they view themselves. They do not feel cursed because they were traumatized. They do not feel guilty and ashamed and responsible. Or if they see ways that they played into it, so the person could have driven more safely when that really bad accident happened, right? Then they can see that for what it is, right? We can take learning and growth away from negative things, right? Without those things changing our brains so that we're afraid of getting out of bed in the morning, right? So it's a change in conception, and ultimately that is a different conception of self and world, right? That is empowering, right? That says, look, I can navigate forward. I can make good decisions. I can be aware of the emotions that are going on inside of me. I can look at them instead of being driven by them, right? There are all sorts of ways that we can better understand ourselves. You know, I write in the book about this idea of like waking up in the back of a car and there's some evil phantom driving the car, right? And that's often what happens where, and to see a person struck by this, like I'm not even in control of my life anymore, like I was, right? My decisions are coming through the lens of depression, avoidance, and alcohol, right? And the idea that like it does not have to be that way. Like get back into the driver's seat of your life, right? And when people feel that they can do that, they're competent to do that, someone will help them do that, right? It's not that they're going to do a worse job than the phantom that's driving the car, so to speak, right? And so we help people own what's theirs, you know, their ability to understand, their ability to change, their ability to bring compassion to the fore, to bring knowledge to the fore, to see with clarity. And it is just remarkable how empowering that is, just as it is often remarkable how our helping systems very often, not always, don't even go anywhere near that. Right?
Well, this is the question I want to ask you. What you're talking about here Is this the way psychiatrists are generally speaking, psychiatrists are treating individuals? Is there the knowledge about trauma that you're sharing here?
No, I think it's not the way people are being treated by psychiatrists or therapists, right? Because psychiatrists can be therapists, but there are many people with various aspects of training, right, who are therapists, right? So whether it's a psychiatrist who's also bringing medicine to bear, or it is any number of people with various backgrounds who are acting as therapists, this is not how this often goes, because we live in this polish the hood when there's a problem in the engine world, and we don't want to invest time and human effort into people. So a person gets 10 sessions of CBT, right? That's what their insurance is authorized. Or, well, they can go see a psychiatrist, but there's, there can be a 45-minute intake appointment and then 15-minute follow-ups every 6 weeks. I mean, so what we're doing there, it's just a poor investment. It's like when we're surprised that like our bridges are falling down, right? Our infrastructure isn't doing well. Well, the answer is like, well, of course that's the case. We haven't invested in it, right? Maybe we fix a pothole when what we really need to do is fix that stretch of road, right? Or go shore up that bridge. When we don't invest in ourselves, in our futures, we get the results, right? We get the results of our investment. And that's what we see because our healthcare systems are so avoidant of human time, because human time costs money, right? So then I see so many cases where, yes, there's a psychiatrist involved. And you know what? That psychiatrist may be a good person who just wants to do well, but they've got 4,000 patients on their panel, and all they can do in 15 minutes is like, wait, what's your symptoms? Okay, let's dial this medicine up, dial that medicine down, do this, do that, then they go. Then there's a therapist involved who often is not the psychiatrist, because now we're talking human time and the psychiatrist costs more money, right? So now there's a therapist involved, and that therapist who also may be well-trained or good at what they do, or in both cases, psychiatrist or therapist may not be, because the systems are so focused on throughput, they may not be well-trained and not know what to do, but they're also focusing on polishing the hood. What techniques can I give you so you can distract your thoughts? I mean, it's not like there's no validity to that, but do we ever look at the root cause? And very often I'd ask the therapist, gosh, have you thought about where it's coming from? And you get a blank. No, of course, the person isn't doing that either, because there's no time to do that, or there's not going to be time to fully explore it, or the person isn't trained to do it. So no, we're not investing in ourselves. And we have a healthcare system that is so focused on the bottom line and wastes so many resources and expends so many resources not providing care, that how can we look at our system when we put so much money into it and our results are abysmal compared to other developed world systems? How can we look at it and think that we're not just selling ourselves short?
How does this change? I mean, I know that's a huge question, but how does this perspective change?
Well, so my thought about that, which I incorporated strongly into the book, is I don't know that this is going to change just looking at the medical care part of it. Right? Because it's hard, you talk to somebody who's waited with a family member in an emergency room for 6 hours when, in a gurney at the side of a hall with 10 other gurneys. Nobody wants that. And people realize that's not okay, but not everybody has that experience. And it's hard to get people to see what is that really like? And that could happen to you too. It's hard to get people to see that. Right. So I think it's hard to change by going just to the medical system, even though it's a gargantuan system that affects our lives. Right. I think we're seeing the problems of trauma and the problems of not investing in ourselves, the problems of the lowest common denominator in our society at large. Right. We see it in our political dialogue. We see it when facts and truth don't matter anymore, but people's opinions get angrier and angrier. Right? And I don't know how one could look at our society and think, yeah, we're doing okay. Right. We're not, right? Whether it's the problems of racism, it's the problems of how we responded to the pandemic. It's just the political fighting in ways that would have gotten a person suspended from middle school, right? But now we tolerate on the big stages of what are we really doing? right? Do we need to invest more in ourselves, in not just our education system, but in preventing trauma? Because when I see angry people who are, their approach to life is through a lens of racism or gender discrimination or sexuality-based discrimination, you see, like, why? Right? Like, why are people so angry and so focused on, I don't really care what the facts are, right? If you and I differ, I'm going to attack you, right? And that's going to feel good to me, right? How does that feel good unless a person feels disempowered, afraid, vulnerable, right? I mean, even before the pandemic, I remember reading these statistics about, how great the economy was doing because the unemployment rate was so low. Okay, that's one metric, right? It was also true that a huge percentage of people in this country could not shoulder like an unexpected, like $700, bill without their lives coming apart. And so we have entire areas of endeavor, entire industries, like the service industry is just one example, where people can't make a living, right? Where it's so precarious. And I think, the old American, hey, we're going to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and we're going to make our way. Like, I'm all for that, right? But I think that has progressed to a point where it is so easy for us to just look at today and look at ourselves today and not look at what are other people's tribulations? What are our own tribulations? Have we created a society that just really doesn't care that much? I mean, how many times are we going to say, gosh, I feel so sorry for those people who lost a child to murder, right? Like we should be aghast and weeping, all of us, right? Not looking at, well, now really that just evolves into political argument again, when what's happened is unimaginable. Yeah. Right? To just imagine the scene, in these classrooms, imagine what that was like, it's so unbearable that it leads us away from it. And I think that then we're sort of inadvertently complicit with sort of thinking things are okay. And all those deaths to COVID, 100,000 overdose deaths a year, mass shootings more rapidly than we can count, like, we're not okay. And if we don't look at trauma and if we don't look at how we're handling ourselves as a society, well, I don't think we're going to be okay. And that's the truth of the world too. It's not just because we're America, we're going to be okay. Like, I'll bet the Roman Empire thought that too, right? And how many other nations have thought that? There's no guarantee we're going to be okay, no more than there is for any other place in the world. And my very strong worry is, unless we make real change, we are not going to be okay.
Two final questions here as we wind up. What initially was the impetus or pull for you to move from consulting into medicine?
So part of this I do write about in the book as well is, so I was unhappy in the career path that I had. There's nothing wrong with it, and it served a lot of people well, but it just wasn't making me happy. I wasn't happy with my life, and my life wasn't super healthy because I sort of had blinders on. So I'm 23 or 24. I can't change anything, right? Like, I just didn't understand. And, I tragically lost my youngest brother to suicide. And after that tragedy, yes, thank you. And after that, it helped me understand. I learned so much about trauma, including my own reaction of guilt and shame and how I wasn't taking care of myself. And one silver lining, and I think there are silver linings of even awful things, if we understand ourselves and understand life better, is it told me, hey, like, you got one life to live and you want to go off and you want to learn things and you want to help people in this direct one-to-one way, and like, go do that. It doesn't matter. You're giving up your income and, and you're not going to have a good, people say, you're not going to have an income for 10 years again. Like, well, I didn't, and it was fine. Right. So, because I realized I'm going to live my life and do the things I'm driven inside to do. And that was a very profound anti-trauma set of choices for me that, in retrospect, having the education and training I got, I could really understand that more. So understand my own trauma in the context of what that was for me before I understood anything about it, and how did the later understanding inform me. And that also informs and runs throughout the book.
I mean, I asked that question because you're obviously driven and passionate about this topic. I mean, I can feel it. I mean, that in and of itself is empowering. What I mean, you said so much here that's I think really rich, but in closing, what do you want the listeners, the therapists, the survivors to take away from this?
Yeah. Look, this is not esoteric. This is not some bleeding heart concept, right? This is real. And the changes it makes in the brain are real and are validated so many times over by modern science, right? So for people to look at this, take this seriously, and then look at what's going on inside of yourself, right? We can benefit from a therapist, but we don't need a therapist to say, like, what is my self-talk? Right? What am I saying to myself? What's my narrative of my life? Is there something that's happened in me where I kind of feel different afterwards? What about somebody around me? Is there somebody who seems different in my life? Maybe I know something has happened, but like no one's talking about it, right? Or maybe I don't know something has happened, but boy, that person has changed, right? That there's a lot we can do about it. It's based in science, and the science tells us we can identify it and make it better. So to take it seriously, that from each of us as individuals to all of us as a society, this is running through us. And I think the evidence and data is incontrovertible. It's just so clear. So to look at this and think, well, how can I think about this in my own life? How can I make change in my own life or in the circle of people around me? How can I just do some good in the world today? What triggers defensiveness in me? And do I get angry or aggressive or frustrated, or do I recoil or shrink away? But like, let's take stock of this, because just doing that can help us be healthier today. Right? Some small progress and change today that raises the hope and leads to greater progress and greater change over time.
Appreciate that. The book is Trauma, the Invisible Epidemic. What is the best way that people can learn more about you, Dr. Conti?
So there's a website for me, which has links to podcasts such as this, the things that I've done, and also links to get the book if people choose to. And that's Dr. Paul Conti. It's just Dr. and then PAULCONTI. So drpaulconti.com is the website for the book. Pacific Premier Group, just strung together, pacificpremiergroup.com is the clinic. And the clinic, that will talk about how we approach the work that we do. And there are also links to some of the media such as this that I've done there too. So those two websites would be helpful.
And I'll have both of those linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Dr. Conti, thank you so much. So inspiring and helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you. I appreciate you having me on.
Okay, take care.
Take care.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And if you'd like to join the hundreds of other therapists who are each month keeping up to date and informed and inspired about what's going on in the world of trauma, I'd love to invite you to head on over to the Trauma Therapist newsletter. That's the traumatherapistnewsletter.com.